The flight attendant's voice was a whip crack in the quiet first-class cabin. "I have had it with your attitude," she shrieked at the calm black man in seat 1A. "You will listen to me or you will get off this plane." She saw a problem passenger in a worn fishing vest who didn't belong. She had no idea she was screaming at the Honorable Marcus Thorne, a United States Circuit judge, whose authority flowed directly from the Constitution. And she was about to learn that when you unlawfully challenge a federal judge, the consequences are not corporate. They are federal. The airport in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, is a jewel box of rustic elegance, a gentle gateway between the rugged majesty of the Grand Tetons and the humming, pressurized world of modern air travel. It was here on a crisp, late summer afternoon that a man stood looking out at the mountains, his mind a world away from the peaks. To any observer, he was unremarkable. He was in his late 50s with a lean, athletic build that spoke of a disciplined life. His face was thoughtful, framed by close-cropped graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He was dressed not for business, but for escape well-worn jeans, sturdy hiking boots, and a multi-pocketed fishing vest over a simple flannel shirt. He looked like a local, perhaps a fishing guide, or a retired professor enjoying a quiet moment before a flight. This man was Judge Marcus Thorne, and his quiet life was a carefully constructed fortress. In his professional world in the hallowed marble halls of Washington, D.C., he was a titan. As a United States Circuit Judge for the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, he was one of the most powerful jurists in the nation. His decisions shaped federal law. His opinions were dissected by the country's greatest legal minds, and his name was perennially on the short list for the Supreme Court. Before his appointment to the bench, he had been a legendary federal prosecutor, a man who had fearlessly taken on mob bosses, corrupt politicians, and white-collar criminals, earning a reputation for his razor-sharp intellect and his unshakable, almost stoic calm. But for the past 2 weeks, he had been just Marcus, a man alone with a river and a fly rod. His annual fishing trip to the Snake River was a sacred ritual, a necessary act of decompression from a life spent weighing the heaviest burdens of the law. It was where he recalibrated his soul, finding clarity in the patient, methodical rhythm of the cast and drift. Now it was time to return to the world. He was flying home to D.C. with a connection in Chicago. His first-class ticket on Summit Air Flight 385 was a practical necessity, allowing him the space to review the dense legal briefs he carried in his worn leather satchel. He sought no special treatment, no recognition. Anonymity was his most prized luxury. As he boarded the flight, he offered a polite nod to the flight attendants at the door. He made his way to his seat, 1A, a spacious pod at the very front of the aircraft. He stowed his satchel and took off his fishing vest, placing it carefully in the small personal closet. His only other luggage was a sturdy 2-foot-long aluminum tube that protected his beloved fly rod. It was this tube that would become the flashpoint, the trivial object around which a catastrophic drama would unfold. The flight attendant assigned to his section of the cabin was a young woman named Melissa Evans. Melissa, or Missy as her friends called her, was relatively new to the job, just over a year with the airline. She was ambitious, but deeply insecure, and she compensated for her insecurity by wielding the airline's rulebook with the rigid, zealous authority of a true believer. She saw the complex world of air travel not as a service industry, but as a rigid hierarchy, and she, in her crisp uniform, was a non-commissioned officer, tasked with enforcing its laws. Her worldview was a simple binary. There were people who followed the rules, and there were problems. When she saw Marcus Thorne, her internal alarms, clouded by a fog of unconscious bias, began to ring. She saw a black man, dressed in what she considered to be shabby, outdoorsy clothes, sitting in the most expensive seat on the plane. Her mind, unable to reconcile these conflicting data points, defaulted to suspicion. He did not look like the CEOs and senators she imagined were her typical clientele. He must be, she concluded, an upgrader, a competition winner, someone who didn't know the unwritten rules of this exclusive club. He was in her binary world a potential problem. She decided to watch him closely, waiting for the inevitable infraction that would confirm her prejudice. She would not have to wait long. The boarding process continued, the first-class cabin slowly filling with the quiet rustle of expensive coats and the soft clicks of designer luggage. Judge Thorne settled into his seat, the familiar weight of his legal briefs pulling his mind back toward the intricate legal puzzles that awaited him in Washington. He was reviewing a complex case involving federal energy regulations, his focus absolute. He was brought back to the present by a sharp, clipped voice at his elbow. "Sir." "Excuse me, sir." He looked up to see Melissa Evans standing over him. Her arms crossed her expression, a mask of stern disapproval. She was pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the overhead bin above his seat. "That tube," she said, her voice unnecessarily loud. "It's not stowed correctly. It's a violation of FAA regulations." Judge Thorne looked up. His aluminum fly rod case was lying flat in the bin, alongside a few small roller-board bags. It seemed perfectly secure. "I believe it's fine," he said, his voice a calm, low baritone. "It's well within the size limits, and it's not obstructing the closure of the door. It needs to be placed on its side, vertically, against the wall of the bin." Melissa insisted, her tone becoming instructive, as if speaking to a child. "That is the proper procedure for items of this shape. It ensures it won't shift during takeoff." Judge Thorne, a man who had presided over cases involving the most arcane and complex federal regulations imaginable, recognized this for what it was, a fabrication. There was no such specific FAA regulation for the vertical placement of fishing rod tubes. It was a house rule invented on the spot, a way for this young woman to assert her authority over a passenger she had already deemed out of place. He chose the path of least resistance. He was a guest on this aircraft, and he believed in respecting the crew's authority, even if it was being misapplied. "Very well," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. He stood up, opened the bin, and rearranged the tube to her exact specifications. It was now, in his expert opinion, less secure than it had been before, but he had complied. "Is that better?" he asked politely. His easy compliance seemed to frustrate her. She had expected an argument, a confrontation that would validate her assessment of him as a problem. His quiet, dignified acquiescence gave her nothing to push against. "It will have to do," she said, with a sniff, and then her eyes fell on his worn leather satchel at his feet. "And that bag is too large to be a personal item. That will also have to go in the overhead bin." "It's a briefcase," Judge Thorne stated, his patience beginning to fray at the edges. "It fits perfectly under the seat in front of me, as per standard procedure. Our first-class pods do not have underseat storage in the same way." Sir, she countered, her voice sharp with condescension. "For takeoff and landing, all items of that size must be in the overhead. It's for your own safety." Again, this was a selective and overly rigid interpretation of the rules. But again, Judge Thorne chose to comply. He opened the bin a second time, and placed his briefcase inside, nestling it beside the fly rod tube. He sat back down, his expression unreadable. He had met her every demand, however trivial and nonsensical. He had been polite, compliant, and quiet. By any reasonable measure, the interaction should have been over. But for Melissa, it was not about the bag or the tube. It was about her initial biased judgment. She had profiled him as a man who did not belong, and his quiet dignity was a direct contradiction to her worldview. She felt an irrational need to be proven right to provoke a reaction from him that would justify her suspicion. She decided to push one more time, a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again," she demanded, her hand outstretched. Judge Thorne looked at her. The request was completely out of protocol. His pass had been scanned at the gate. He was in his assigned seat. This was no longer about rules. It was a direct personal challenge. It was harassment. And it was happening in the full view of the other first-class passengers who were now watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity. The demand to see his boarding pass again was a naked power play. It was an insinuation that he, the calm, cooperative passenger, had somehow boarded the plane under false pretenses and was occupying a seat that was not his. Judge Thorne, a man whose entire life was a testament to the power of quiet dignity and intellectual rigor, felt a foreign emotion begin to stir within him, a profound, weary anger. He had come from 2 weeks of solitude and peace, and in the space of 5 minutes he had been subjected to this petty, prejudiced display of false authority. "My boarding pass was scanned at the gate," he said, his voice, now devoid of its earlier warmth, becoming flat and cold. "I am in my assigned seat, 2A. I have complied with all of your instructions regarding my luggage. This interaction is now bordering on harassment. Please return to your duties." He had delivered a clear, final boundary. He had used the language of the law, harassment, a warning shot that a more experienced or intelligent crew member would have instantly recognized. Melissa, however, heard it as a challenge. Her authority had been questioned. This man, this imposter, was refusing a direct order. Her insecurity coupled with her prejudice now curdled into outright hostility. Her composure, already fragile, shattered completely. "Excuse me," she exclaimed, her voice rising in disbelief. "My duties." "My duty is to ensure the safety and security of this cabin, and that includes making sure everyone is where they are supposed to be. Now you will show me your boarding pass, or I will have you removed from this aircraft." Her voice was no longer just loud. It was a yell, a sharp, unprofessional shriek that cut through the placid first-class atmosphere like a shard of glass. Every passenger in the cabin, including those who had been trying to ignore the confrontation, now turned to stare. In seat 3C, a young woman who had been furiously typing on her laptop looked up, her expression of annoyance shifting to one of stunned recognition. Her name was Dr. Amelia Reed. She was a recent graduate of Yale Law School and was currently serving as a law clerk for a justice of the United States Supreme Court. She was one of the most brilliant young legal minds in the country, and she recognized the man in seat 1A instantly. It was Judge Marcus Thorne. She had read every one of his appellate opinions. He was a living legend, a judicial icon, and he was being screamed at by a flight attendant. A wave of horrified disbelief washed over her. She has no idea who she is yelling at, Amelia thought. This is a Category 5 professional suicide. Judge Thorne, now the subject of a public spectacle, remained preternaturally calm, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He knew that the situation had crossed a critical threshold. This was no longer about a petty tyrant on a power trip. This was about a direct public challenge to his right to travel without harassment, a right afforded to any citizen, but one with particular implications for a federal officer on his way back to his post. He decided to make one final attempt at de-escalation. "Young lady," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that was somehow more intimidating than her shout. "I am going to give you one opportunity to walk away from this situation, and I strongly advise you to take it." His refusal to be intimidated, his quiet, unshakable confidence, was the final spark on the tinder of Melissa's rage. She was losing control, and it infuriated her. "That's it, I've had enough of your attitude," she shrieked, her face now red, her professionalism completely gone. "I don't know how you got this seat, but you will follow my instructions. I am in charge here." "Greg," she yelled, summoning her superior, "I need the purser at the front of the cabin. We have a passenger who is refusing to comply with crew member instructions." The purser, Greg, a jaded middle-aged man with a weary slump, arrived from the galley. He saw Melissa agitated and pointing, and Judge Thorne calm and seated. His experience had taught him that the easiest path was always to back the crew member and pacify the situation by removing the problem passenger. He didn't ask for Thorne's side of the story. He addressed him with a tired, condescending sigh. "Sir, I understand there's been a disagreement, but on this aircraft, the flight attendant's instructions are not optional. Now we can either resolve this quietly, or I can call the captain and have the gate agent come back and remove you. What's it going to be?" The threat was now official, backed by the authority of the senior crew member. They had created a united front of institutional arrogance. They were going to eject a United States Circuit judge from a flight because they did not like the look of his fishing vest. Judge Thorne knew that his fortress of anonymity had to fall. The time for quiet compliance was over. It was time for the law to make an appearance. Judge Marcus Thorne looked from the purser's tired, dismissive face to the flight attendant's triumphant, hostile glare. He had been given an ultimatum: comply with their baseless demands or be forcibly removed. He had been a federal prosecutor for 2 decades and a judge for another. He had faced down armed men in courtrooms and stared into the eyes of unrepentant criminals. He was not a man who responded well to baseless threats. He let out a slow, deliberate sigh, a sound of profound disappointment. It was the sigh of a man who had hoped for reason and had been met with belligerent ignorance. The peaceful solitude of his fishing trip felt a lifetime away. He was now against his will back on the bench. "Very well," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to suck the energy out of the confrontation. "You wish to verify my identity and my right to be in this seat. I believe I have the proper documentation to satisfy your inquiry." Melissa and Greg exchanged a smug look. They believed he was finally capitulating, about to produce the boarding pass they had demanded. They expected him to be cowed, embarrassed. Judge Thorne reached not for the seat-back pocket, where he had placed his paper boarding pass, but into the inner pocket of his flannel shirt. He pulled out a worn black leather bifold wallet. It was a simple, unadorned object, the kind any man might carry. He did not open it quickly. His movements were methodical, deliberate, as if he were presenting evidence in his own courtroom. He flipped it open. The object inside was not a driver's license or a credit card. It was a gold-embossed, eagle-crested badge, polished to a brilliant shine. Next to it, under a protective laminate, was a photo identification card issued by the United States government. The card featured a formal, unsmiling photograph of the man in seat 1A. Below the photo, the text was stark official and utterly devastating: Marcus A. Thorne, United States Circuit Judge, U.S. Court of Appeals, District of Columbia Circuit. The cabin, which had been filled with the tense whispers of the unfolding drama, fell into a profound and absolute silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the auxiliary power unit on the tarmac outside. Judge Thorne did not flash the badge. He held it open, steady and unwavering for both Melissa and Greg to see clearly. I believe he said, his voice calm and level, devoid of any triumph that you will find, "My travel authorization is in order. My official duties require me to return to Washington, D.C. This travel is booked and paid for by the United States government." The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Melissa Evans froze. The color drained from her face, leaving a pale, sickly mask of her earlier rage. Her mouth hung slightly agape. Her eyes, which had been blazing with self-righteous anger, were now wide with a dawning, bottomless horror. The intricate web of assumptions and prejudices she had built around this man-imposter freeloader problem passenger had not just been challenged, it had been vaporized by a single, undeniable symbol of federal authority. She was not just yelling at a customer. She was harassing a federal judge. The chasm between her perceived reality and the actual reality was so vast that her mind simply shut down. She stood utterly motionless, her hand still half raised in a gesture of accusation, a statue of her own career's demise. The purser Greg had a more visceral reaction. He physically recoiled, taking a step backward, as if the badge had emitted a physical force. He looked from the credentials to Judge Thorne's face, then back again. A wave of pure, uncut terror washed over him. He was a senior employee. He knew enough to understand the gravity of this. They hadn't just made a customer service error. They had blundered into a jurisdictional minefield. They had interfered with a federal officer. They had picked a fight with a branch of the United States government. In seat 3 Dr. Amelia Reed, the Supreme Court clerk, let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It's over, she thought. And now the real trouble begins. She knew that interfering with a federal judge in the performance of their duties was not just a sackable offense. It was a potential federal crime. Judge Thorne held his credentials for a moment longer, ensuring the weight of their meaning had fully settled in. Then, with the same deliberate motion, he folded the wallet and placed it back in his shirt pocket. He looked at the two stunned, silent crew members. Now he said his voice, the quiet, unquestionable authority of the courtroom. As I was saying before, we were so rudely interrupted. I believe it is time for you to return to your duties. The power dynamic had not just been reversed. It had been annihilated. The petty kingdom of the first-class cabin now had a new and far more powerful sovereign. The silence that followed the revelation was a palpable entity. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of pure shock. For a long 10 seconds, no one in the first-class cabin moved or spoke. The only sound was the gentle whir of the air conditioning. Melissa Evans remained frozen, a statue of horror, her mind unable to process the sheer magnitude of her mistake. Greg the purser was the first to break his mind, rebooting into a mode of frantic, desperate damage control. Your Honor, he stammered, the honorific-sounding alien and clumsy on his lips. I apologize. We apologize. There has been a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. He shot a murderous glare at Melissa, who seemed incapable of movement. Judge Thorne simply looked at him, his expression unreadable. He did not accept the apology. He did not acknowledge it. He merely waited. The sound of the cockpit door opening broke the spell. Captain Henderson, a veteran pilot with a calm, authoritative demeanor, had been alerted by another flight attendant about the escalating commotion in his cabin. He stepped out his face, a mask of professional concern, expecting to find a disruptive drunk or an air rage incident. Instead, he found his two lead cabin crew members standing pale and trembling before a silent seated passenger. What in God's name is going on here? Captain Henderson demanded, his voice a low, commanding rumble. Greg practically sprinted to the captain's side, whispering frantically into his ear, his words a jumbled torrent of federal judge credentials and huge mistake. The captain's expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief, and then to a grim, focused seriousness. He looked at Judge Thorne, then at the terrified face of his flight attendant, and he understood instantly that his flight, and possibly his airline's reputation, was now in serious jeopardy. He walked forward and stood before Judge Thorne, his posture one of profound professional respect. "Sir," he began, his voice calm and steady. "I am Captain Henderson. I have just been partially briefed on the situation, and I want to be the first to say that whatever has happened here is my responsibility. The conduct of the crew on my aircraft is my command. It appears my command has failed you. For that, I am deeply and truly sorry." Judge Thorne finally spoke, his voice measured and devoid of anger. He respected the chain of command, and the captain was the ultimate authority on this vessel. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your candor. May I see your credentials, sir?" the captain asked. It was not a demand, but a respectful request for verification, a necessary step in his own assessment of the disaster. Judge Thorne nodded and once again produced the leather bifold. The captain examined it closely, his face grim. He handed it back with a solemn nod. "Your Honor, I am mortified. Please tell me what I can do to make this right." "You can start Judge Thorne," said his gaze shifting to the still-frozen Melissa, "by instructing your crew. It is my understanding that a flight attendant's primary duty is the safety and comfort of the passengers. It is not to act as an inquisitor, nor to fabricate regulations to harass a paying customer. Perhaps a refresher on that distinction is in order." The captain's face hardened. He turned to Melissa. "Miss Evans?" he said, his voice now like ice. "You are to report to the aft galley. You will remain there for the duration of this flight and will have no further contact with any passengers. Is that understood?" The direct command finally broke her paralysis. She gave a small, jerky nod, her eyes wide with terror. She turned and practically fled down the aisle, her escape a public spectacle of her own undoing. The captain then turned to Greg. "Mr. Thompson, you are the purser on this flight. You are the senior cabin crew member. You had an opportunity to de-escalate this situation, and instead, you enabled it. You will confine your duties to the galley as well. The junior attendants will handle the cabin service. We will discuss your future with this company when we are on the ground." Greg nodded meekly, his face ashen, and retreated toward the galley, his career in tatters. With the immediate problem contained, Captain Henderson turned back to Judge Thorne. "Your Honor, again, my deepest apologies. Please allow us to offer you anything you might desire. Champagne. Your meal choice is, of course, guaranteed." Judge Thorne held up a hand. "Captain, I appreciate the gesture, but I do not require any special treatment. I require professional service, the same service that should be afforded to every citizen who buys a ticket on this airline." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "However, this incident does raise a significant question that I would like you to convey to your corporate leadership. My travel to Washington is for the performance of my official duties. An attempt by any party to deliberately impede the travel of a federal judicial officer could be interpreted as a violation of federal law. Specifically, 18 U.S. Code, Section 111, which pertains to interfering with a federal officer. I am not making an accusation, Captain. I am merely stating a fact. I trust that you and your airline's general counsel will give that fact the serious consideration it deserves." The captain's blood ran cold. This was no longer a customer service complaint that could be smoothed over with frequent flyer miles. Judge Thorne had just invoked the United States Code. He had elevated the incident from a corporate problem to a federal one. I will convey your message to our leadership immediately, Your Honor," the captain said, his mind reeling. "Thank you, Captain," Judge Thorne replied. He then turned his gaze to the window, a clear signal that for him the conversation was over. He had presented his case. The ball was now in the airline's court, and he knew with the certainty of a man who had written the law that their next move would determine whether this ended with a quiet, expensive settlement or with a full-blown federal investigation. The moment Captain Henderson returned to the cockpit, he used the ACR's system to send a terse explosive message to Summit Air's Central Operations Control in Denver. The message was flagged urgent, legal, ensuring it bypassed the usual dispatchers and went straight to the senior executive on duty. SA 385, Jack's Ord, urgent, legal incident in F cabin. Passenger in 1A is U.S. Circuit Judge Marcus Thorne. Cabin crew engaged in harassment threatened removal. Judge Thorne has invoked 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 111 interference. Will federal officer. Recommend immediate notification of General Counsel. Standing by. At the Summit Air Headquarters, this message landed with the force of a bomb. The senior operations officer read it, his eyes widening in horror, and immediately picked up his emergency line to the office of Catherine Finch, the airline's executive vice president and general counsel. Catherine Finch was a formidable corporate lawyer, a veteran of countless brutal negotiations and billion-dollar lawsuits. She was known for her icy demeanor and her ability to make any problem, no matter how large, manageable. When she received the call, she listened to the operations officer read the captain's message, her expression hardening with each word. A federal judge, she repeated, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. Section 111, are you kidding me? This was not a disgruntled passenger threatening to sue on Twitter. This was a member of the Article 3 judiciary, a co-equal branch of the United States government, formally suggesting that her employees may have committed a federal crime. This was a 5-alarm corporate fire that threatened to burn the entire company to the ground. Her mind immediately shifted into crisis management mode. Her first priority was to control the narrative to contain the incident before it could escalate further. She knew that when the plane landed in Chicago, Judge Thorne would be met by a phalanx of federal officials, the U.S. Marshals who provide security for the judiciary. She could not allow them to be the only ones there. She needed to get her people to the judge first, to apologize, to de-escalate, to turn this back into a corporate matter before it became a criminal one. She issued a series of rapid-fire commands. The airline station manager at O'Hare was to be at the arrival gate personally. The head of corporate security for the Midwest region was to be there with him. She wanted her best, most experienced people, the smoothest talkers, the most polished professionals. Their mission intercept Judge Thorne, offer a profound, unreserved apology, and assure him that the airline would take immediate and decisive action. They were to be a wall of corporate contrition. What Catherine Finch failed to understand was the mind of Judge Marcus Thorne. He was not just a powerful man. He was a brilliant legal strategist. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, he anticipated the airline's exact move. He knew they would try to manage him, to control the situation, to sweep the federal implications under the rug with a corporate apology. He saw this not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a potential attempt to interfere with a pending federal matter, to influence a witness who, in this case, was himself. He would not allow it. He took out his satellite phone, a government-issued device he carried for emergency communications. He did not call the airline. He did not call his clerk. He dialed a number he knew by heart. It was the direct line to the command center of the United States Marshals Service for the Northern District of Illinois. A duty officer answered. "Yes, Marshals." "This is Judge Marcus Thorne, D.C. Circuit," he stated calmly. "I am on approach to O'Hare International Airport landing in approximately 20 minutes on Summit Air Flight 385 at Gate C-17. I have reason to believe that employees of the airline may attempt to interfere with my egress from the aircraft in a manner that could be construed as obstruction of a federal officer in the performance of his duties. I am requesting a security escort from the aircraft to the landside terminal. Please have 2 deputies meet me on the jet bridge upon arrival." The request was unprecedented, and it carried the full weight of his judicial authority. The duty officer didn't question it. "Understood, Your Honor. The deputies will be there." Judge Thorne disconnected the call. He had made his move. On the ground at O'Hare, two separate forces were now converging on Gate C-17. One was a team of corporate fixers, armed with apologies and gift cards, hoping to contain a public relations disaster. The other was a pair of federal law enforcement officers, armed with the full authority of the United States government, tasked with protecting a federal judge. The jet bridge was about to become a battleground of jurisdictions, and the airline had no idea they had just brought a corporate knife to a constitutional gunfight. The moment Summit Air Flight 385 connected with the jet bridge at Gate C-17, the air inside the cabin was thick with an unspoken tension. The usual chaotic energy of arrival, the clicking of seat belts, the rustling of bags, was replaced by a hushed, expectant silence. Every passenger in the first-class cabin knew this was no ordinary arrival. The first person to the aircraft door was the O'Hare station manager, a man named Robert Paulson. He was a slick, polished executive, hand-picked by Catherine Finch for his ability to smooth over the roughest of situations. Beside him was the airline's regional head of security. They had their apologies rehearsed, their faces arranged in masks of deep, sincere concern. Their mission was simple: intercept the judge, insulate him from any further trouble, and de-escalate the situation before it could metastasize. The cabin door opened. The first person they saw was Captain Henderson, his face grim. Mr. Paulson, the captain, said, his voice low. "Judge Thorne is in seat 1A. He is waiting to deplane." Paulson nodded, taking a deep breath. "Thank you, Captain. We'll take it from here." He and the security chief stepped onto the aircraft, preparing to walk down the aisle and deliver their well-rehearsed apologies. They never made it past the galley. Blocking their path were two men. They were not wearing airline uniforms. They were dressed in conservative dark suits, their posture erect, their faces impassive. Their jackets were cut in a way that did little to conceal the firearms on their hips. In their hands they held their credentials. They were Deputy United States Marshals. The lead marshal, a tall, imposing man with cold, clear eyes, addressed the two airline executives without a flicker of emotion. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice a calm, flat baritone, "this aircraft is now a federally protected space. You will remain here. We are here to escort Judge Thorne from the aircraft. He will not be speaking with anyone at this time." Robert Paulson was flabbergasted. He stared at the marshals, his carefully prepared script evaporating from his mind. I beg your pardon," he stammered. "We are the senior management for Summit Air. We are here to speak with our passenger Judge Thorne to offer our apology." "The judge is not your passenger at this moment," the marshal replied, his voice unyielding. "He is a United States Circuit judge under the protection of the U.S. Marshals Service. This is now an official federal matter. Any attempt to interfere with our protective detail or to make contact with the judge without our express permission will be considered a violation of 18 U.S. Code, Section 1505, obstruction of proceedings before departments, agencies, and committees. I strongly advise you against that course of action." The corporate authority of Summit Air, which had seemed so absolute inside the airplane, had just collided with the sovereign authority of the United States government. The airline executives, for all their power within their own company, were now just civilians being given a lawful order by federal officers. They were completely and utterly outranked. The marshals moved past the stunned executives and down the aisle. One stood at the head of the aisle, creating a human barrier. The other approached seat 1A. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "we're here to escort you." Judge Thorne nodded, gathering his satchel and his fly rod tube. He stood and walked to the front of the plane. He gave a single polite nod to Captain Henderson. He did not even glance at the two pale, horrified airline managers who were now being held at bay in their own galley. As Judge Thorne deplaned, flanked by the two marshals, another passenger rose from her seat. It was Dr. Amelia Reed, the Supreme Court clerk. She approached the lead marshal. "Excuse me, Deputy," she said, her voice clear and confident. "My name is Amelia Reed. I am a clerk at the Supreme Court. I witnessed the entirety of the incident involving Judge Thorne. Should a formal inquiry be opened, I wish to provide a statement as a witness." She handed him her official court business card. The marshal took the card and nodded gravely. "Thank you, Dr. Reed. We'll be in touch." The addition of a witness from the highest court in the land was the final, devastating blow for the airline. The incident was no longer just the word of the judge against the crew. It was now corroborated by a highly credible, legally brilliant observer. Judge Thorne and his escort walked down the jet bridge, a moving bubble of federal power. As they reached the gate, Robert Paulson made one last, desperate attempt. "Your Honor," he called out, "please just a moment of your time." The lead marshal paused, turning his head slightly. "The judge has no comment," he said, his voice echoing in the now silent gate area. And with that, they were gone, disappearing into the crowded concourse, leaving behind a grounded flight, 2 terminated careers, and an airline in the throes of a full-blown federal crisis. The clash on the jet bridge was over. The authority of the badge had proven absolute. The clash of authority on the jet bridge at O'Hare was not an ending. It was a catalyst. It was the precise, terrifying moment when a simple matter of corporate misconduct metastasized into a full-blown federal inquiry. The quiet constitutional power embodied by Judge Marcus Thorne, having been so crudely challenged, now brought the full crushing weight of the United States government to bear. The karma that followed was not the swift, hot-blooded karma of revenge. It was the cold, methodical, and inescapable karma of the law itself, a vast and intricate machine that, once set in motion, grinds all that stands in its way to dust. The initial report from the U.S. Marshal's protective detail landed on the desk of a senior official in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C. The official, a man named David Chen, read the 2-page summary of the incident on Flight 385 and felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He immediately convened an emergency briefing with the head of the DOJ's Judicial Security Liaison Office. "Let me be perfectly clear," Chen began, his voice low and serious as he paced the secure conference room. "We have 2 frontline employees of a major domestic airline who, according to this report, arbitrarily detained a sitting United States Circuit judge. They verbally harassed him, threatened him with removal, and according to a secondary witness, a Supreme Court clerk, for God's sake, did so based on what appears to be a clear-cut case of racial profiling. Am I reading this correctly?" The liaison, a veteran marshal, nodded grimly. "That's the preliminary assessment, sir. Judge Thorne was by all accounts a model of judicial temperament until the airline's own purser threatened to have him forcibly removed from the flight he was taking to return to his official duties." Chen stopped pacing and stared at the wall where the seal of the Department of Justice was mounted. "This is not a customer service issue," he said, his mind already mapping out the legal and political ramifications. "This is an attack on the institution of the judiciary. It is an act of interference. The integrity of the federal system requires that judicial officers can proceed with their duties unmolested. If we allow a private corporation to create an environment where its employees feel empowered to harass a federal judge, we are setting a dangerous precedent." He turned back to the liaison. "I want a full inquiry opened. Immediately. Issue subpoenas for the 2 flight attendants, the purser, the captain, and any other relevant crew. And get me the full witness statement from Dr. Reed. I want to know everything." The federal machinery, vast and formidable, had begun to turn. For Melissa Evans, the reality of her situation arrived not in a phone call from HR, but in the form of two grim-faced professional investigators from the Department of Justice knocking on the door of her suburban Chicago apartment. They did not raise their voices. They did not make threats. They simply handed her a crisp formal subpoena, commanding her to appear for a deposition at the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse. The sight of the official seal of the United States on the document, the same seal she had seen on Judge Thorne's badge, caused a wave of nausea to wash over her. This was not a corporate reprimand. This was a federal summons. Her deposition, which took place a week later, was a brutal, systematic dismantling of her character. She sat at a long, polished table in a sterile government office, a lawyer from the airline at her side, who seemed more interested in protecting the company than her. Across from her sat a young, sharp, and utterly relentless attorney from the Civil Rights Division. For 4 hours, the lawyer walked Melissa through the incident, second by agonizing second. She was forced under oath, and the threat of perjury, to recount her every thought and action. Ms. Evans, the lawyer, asked, her voice deceptively soft. What was it specifically about Judge Thorne's fishing rod case that you believed to be a violation of FAA regulations? It just didn't look secure, Melissa stammered. Can you cite the specific regulation in your training manual that dictates the vertical stowage of cylindrical luggage items? I don't know the exact number. It's a judgment call. So it was your personal judgment, not official procedure, the lawyer pressed. And what in your training led you to believe it was appropriate to demand proof of payment from a ticketed first-class passenger? His ticket looked strange. I felt I had to be sure for security. For security. Or was it Miss Evans that you simply could not believe that a black man in a fishing vest legitimately belonged in seat 1A? The question hung in the air, a perfect, inescapable trap. Melissa crumbled her composure, dissolving into a torrent of tears and self-pitying excuses. She admitted she had made assumptions. She confessed she had lost her temper. She was forced to listen as the lawyer read excerpts from Dr. Amelia Reed's witness statement, a document that clinically and brilliantly detailed how her every action had been a violation of policy and a demonstration of profound unprofessional bias. By the end of the deposition, she was no longer a feisty, authoritative flight attendant. She was just a woman who had been broken on the wheel of her own prejudice, her lies and justifications rendered meaningless under the unblinking eye of the law. While the federal inquiry ground forward, the corporate surrender of Summit Air was already underway. The airline's general counsel, Catherine Finch, found herself in the worst position of her career. She was not in a legal battle she could win through clever maneuvering or aggressive litigation. She was a supplicant, begging a wounded and deeply offended branch of the United States government for mercy. An emergency meeting of the Summit Air Board of Directors was convened. The mood was funereal. Let me be clear, Catherine Finch told the assembled board members, her voice grim. We are no longer in the realm of customer relations. We are in the realm of federal law. The Department of Justice is investigating this not as a service failure, but as a potential criminal conspiracy to interfere with a federal officer. Our best-case scenario is a massive, humiliating, and incredibly expensive settlement. Our worst-case scenario involves criminal charges being brought against the airline itself, which could lead to the revocation of our operating certificates and the end of this company. The board, composed of hard-nosed financiers and former executives, was stunned into silence. They were not moralists, but they understood risk, and this was a risk that threatened their very existence. They gave Catherine Finch a single desperate mandate: make it go away, no matter the cost. The settlement negotiation was a brutal, one-sided affair. Catherine Finch and her team of high-priced lawyers sat across from David Chen and the DOJ's legal team. There was no friendly banter, no negotiation. The government lawyers laid out their terms as a set of non-negotiable demands. First, David Chen began. Summit Air will pay a punitive fine of $5 million to the United States Treasury's Crime Victims Fund. This is not compensation. It is a penalty for the corporation's failure to adequately train and supervise its employees. Catherine's lawyer started to object, but Chen cut him off. This is not a negotiation. This is the price of avoiding prosecution. Second, your airline will enter into a 3-year legally binding corporate integrity agreement with the Department of Justice. During this period, all of your customer-facing training protocols, your HR complaint procedures, and your policies regarding passenger disputes will be subject to the approval and oversight of a federal monitor whom we will appoint and you will pay for. This was the most painful blow, a direct, intrusive occupation of their corporate governance by the federal government. Finally, Chen concluded, Summit Air will issue a full-page public apology in the nation's leading newspapers. The text of this apology will be drafted by our office and approved by the Judiciary's Administrative Council. It will not be an apology for an inconvenience. It will be an apology for the profound disrespect shown to a member of the United States Judiciary and a pledge to the American people that such behavior will never be tolerated again. Catherine Finch looked at the list of demands. It was a complete and total surrender. It would cost her company millions of dollars, subject it to years of humiliating oversight, and forever stain its reputation. She had no choice. We agree to the terms, she said, her voice a defeated whisper. The next day, a full-page ad appeared in the Wall Street Journal. It began, to the esteemed members of the United States Judiciary, and to the American public, an apology. It was a public act of contrition, a corporate entity brought to its knees, forced to confess its sins before the entire nation. The implementation of the settlement was a long and arduous process of institutional chemotherapy. The federal monitor, appointed by the DOJ, was a retired federal judge named Anita Hill-esque figure, perhaps named Judge Anhalt, a woman with a reputation for being both brilliant and utterly uncompromising. Her first day at the Summit Air headquarters was a quiet reign of terror. She requisitioned a boardroom, had the locks changed, and summoned the airline's entire executive team. "Let me make my role here perfectly clear," she told the assembled vice presidents, her voice calm and authoritative. "I am not your consultant. I am not your advisor. I am your court-appointed supervisor. For the next 36 months, my office will have final approval on every aspect of your customer and employee-facing policies. My authority here is absolute and is backed by the full power of a federal court order. We will begin by dismantling your existing training program. It is clearly, demonstrably a failure. Let's get to work." The changes were profound. The old check-the-box training modules were replaced with intensive scenario-based workshops on de-escalation, unconscious bias, and the legal responsibilities of common carriers. The HR department was restructured with a new independent ethics hotline that went directly to the federal monitor's office. The culture of the airline, once defined by apathetic seniority, was slowly and painfully being rebuilt on a foundation of accountability and respect. A year later, in his quiet, book-lined chambers in Washington, D.C., Judge Marcus Thorne was discussing a case with his 3 young law clerks. The case involved a question of corporate liability, and a young clerk was passionately arguing that a company should be held to the highest possible standard for the actions of its employees. Judge Thorne listened patiently. When the clerk finished, he looked out the window for a moment, his gaze distant. Authority, whether it is corporate or judicial, he said, his voice, quiet and reflective, is not a license to command. It is a burden of responsibility. The higher the authority, the greater the responsibility to wield it with wisdom, with restraint, and with a profound sense of humility. A failure to understand that is the most dangerous failure of all. His clerks listened rapt, recognizing the words as a piece of profound judicial philosophy, unaware of the deeply personal experience from which that wisdom had been forged. The final perfect circle of karma closed 2 years after the incident on Flight 385. In the grand, ornate courtroom of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, a young attorney stood before the 3-judge panel, her voice ringing with clarity and conviction. It was Dr. Amelia Reed. Having completed her clerkships, she had taken a position as a trial attorney for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. She was arguing her first major appellate case, a landmark lawsuit against a national hotel chain accused of systemic discriminatory practices. Her legal argument was a tour de force. She moved effortlessly from statutory interpretation to constitutional principles, her passion for justice tempered by a deep and abiding respect for the rule of law. She was everything a great lawyer should be, brilliant, prepared, and utterly dedicated to her cause. In the center seat of the judicial panel, listening intently to her every word, his expression one of deep professional concentration, was Judge Marcus Thorne. When the arguments concluded and the judges rose to leave the bench, Judge Thorne paused for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the young DOJ attorney who had just so brilliantly defended the principles he held most dear. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture that was invisible to everyone else in the courtroom, but to Amelia it was everything. It was a sign of recognition, of mentorship, of shared purpose. As she packed her legal files into her briefcase, Amelia thought back to that chaotic, ugly moment on the plane. She realized then that the incident had been more than just a shocking confrontation. It had been a turning point in her own life. Witnessing Judge Thorne's quiet, unshakable dignity in the face of such crude disrespect had solidified her own resolve. It had transformed her academic interest in civil rights into a burning, lifelong vocation. The hard karma that had so thoroughly and justly destroyed the careers of Melissa Evans and Greg Thompson had not been a closed loop of retribution. It had been a generative force. The weight of the gavel had not just fallen to punish the guilty. It had served to inspire a new champion of the law. The ugly seeds of prejudice, sown in a moment of arrogance at 30,000 feet, had through the strange and powerful alchemy of justice blossomed into a new and brilliant advocate, ready to carry the fight for dignity and equality forward for the next generation. The system, in its slow, grinding, and often imperfect way, had not just corrected a wrong. It had created a new and powerful right. The story of Judge Marcus Thorne is a profound lesson in the nature of authority. It reminds us that while some power is temporarily granted by a uniform or a job title, true authority is built on a foundation of character, integrity, and unwavering dedication to a higher principle. The flight attendant's mistake was not just in yelling at a customer. It was in her complete failure to recognize the quiet, unshakable strength of a man who embodied the very laws she was subject to. This story shows that the consequences of prejudice can escalate far beyond a corporate complaint, entering a realm where the stakes are not just financial, but federal. It is a testament to the idea that in the end, the quiet, steady weight of the gavel is infinitely more powerful than the loudest, angriest voice. What does true authority mean to you? Is it about a title or is it about character? Share your thoughts on this story in the comments below. If this exploration of justice, power, and karma resonated with you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who appreciates a story with substance, and be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell for more deep dives into dramatic, real-life consequences. Thank you for listening.